Greetings. You are now at the NYRSF readings. My name is Barbara Krasnoff. Thank you for coming. Very nice to see you all. We are here tonight to greet author A.C. Wise, who is the author of a brand new book called Wendy, Darling, published by Titan Books, a new retelling of the Peter Pan story. I've read it. It's fabulous. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing her read and then later asking her questions about it. And we will also ask the audience to ask questions, and anybody who has anything to ask AC Wise can say it, and we will ask her for you. But before we do that, I have a few introductory things to say about the NYRSF readings. As you know, we're a week late on this one for unforeseen circumstances. July's reading will occur on Tuesday, July 6th at 7 p.m. The reader is that famous, well-known TBA, to be announced. But but whoever it is, I'm sure it'll be a wonderful person, and it will be on Tuesday, July 6th at 7 p.m. Now, as we all know, things are starting to open up a little bit from the pandemic, and we are looking at the possibility of reopening the readings to a physical space for those who can and who feel comfortable attending in person. However, before that happens, we need to speak with the proprietor of our venue at the Brooklyn Commons, and we also leaning on the side of caution for filling a room full of people. We are hoping, with any luck, to start in the autumn. We will definitely keep everybody informed and go ahead and keep track of us on Facebook or on YouTube. Sorry, on Facebook or on Twitter. All right, well, without any further ado, let me introduce our reader for today. A.C. Wise's short fiction has appeared in publications such as Apex, Clarkesworld, and multiple years' best anthologies. Her work has won the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, as well as being a finalist for the Nebula Award, the Sunburst Award, and the Lambda Literary Award. Additionally, her critical review work has made her a finalist for the Ignite Award. She has 2 collections published with Leaf Press and a novella published by Broken Eye Books. Her debut novel, Wendy, Darling, which we are going to hear from tonight, is newly out from Titan Books. A new short story collection, The Ghost Sequences, will be published by Undertow Books in October 2021. In addition to her fiction, she contributes review columns to Apex Magazine and The Book Smugglers. You can find her online at www.acwise.net or on Twitter as AC_Wise. And without any further ado, here is A.C. Wise. Hi.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me here. As Barbara said, I'm going to read a few excerpts of my new novel, Wendy, Darling, which came out on June 1st. And again, as Barbara mentioned, it's sort of a reimagining of the Peter Pan story, picking up with Wendy, Darling as an adult. So I'm going to read you the beginning of the first chapter and then a little excerpt of the third chapter. And hopefully you like what you hear. So here we go. London, 1931. There is a boy outside her daughter's window. Wendy feels it, like a trickle of starlight whispering in through a gap, a change in the very pressure and composition of the air. She knows, as sure as her own blood and bones, and the knowledge sends her running. Her hairbrush clatters to the floor in her wake. Her bare feet fly over carpeted runners and slap wooden floorboards, past her husband's room and to her daughter's door. It's not just any boy, it's the boy, Peter. Every inch of her skin wakes and crawls. The fine hairs all along the back of her neck stand on end. The storm secreted between her bones for years finally breaking wide. Peter, here, now, after so long. She wants to shout, but she doesn't know what words, and as Wendy skids to a halt, her teeth are bared. It isn't a grimace or a smile, but a kind of animal breathing, panicked and wild. Jane's door stands open a crack. A sliver of moonlight, unnaturally bright, as if carried to London from Neverland, spills across the floor. It touches Wendy's toes as she peers through the gap, unable for a moment to step inside. Even though she's still, her pulse runs rabbit quick. Backlit against that too bright light is the familiar silhouette. A slender boy with his fists planted on his hips, chest puffed out and chin tipped up, hair wild. There's no mistaking Peter as he hovers just beyond the second-floor window. She blinks, and the image remains, not vanishing like every other dream stretched between now and then, between the girl she was and the woman she's become. Of course, Wendy thinks, because this may not be the house she grew up in, but it's still her home. Of course he would find her, and of course he would find her now. Bitterness chases the thought, here and now, after so long. At the same time, she thinks, no, please no. But his two long fingers already tap the glass. Without waiting for her say-so, the window swings wide. Peter enters, and Wendy's heart swoops, and then falls and falls and falls. Once invited, always welcome. That's his way. Peter doesn't notice Wendy as she pushes the hall door open all the way. He flies a circle around the ceiling, and she wills her daughter to stay asleep, wills her tongue to uncurl from the roof of her mouth. Her legs tremble, holding her on the threshold, wanting to fold and drop her to the floor. It's such an easy thing for him to enter, and yet her own body betrays her, refusing to take one step into her daughter's room in her own house. It's unfair. Everything about Peter always was, and it hasn't changed. After years of her wanting and waiting, lying and hoping, he's finally here. And he isn't here for her. Peter lands at the foot of Jane's bed. The covers barely dimple under his weight. A boy in form, but hollow all the way through. Maybe it's the motion, or the light spearing in from the hall behind Wendy. But Jane half wakes, rubbing her eyes. A shout of warning locks in Wendy's throat. "Wendy," Peter says. Hearing her name, Wendy is a child again, toes lifting from the ground, taking flight, about to set off on a grand and delicious adventure. Except he's not looking at her. He's looking at Jane. Wendy bites the inside of her cheek, bites down in place of a scream. Does he have any idea how long it's been? Swallowing the red salt taste of her blood finally unlocks her throat. "Peter, I'm here." It isn't the shout she wishes, only a half-whispered and ragged thing. Peter turns, his eyes bright as the moonlight behind him. They narrow. Suspicion first and then a frown. "Liar, you're not Wendy." He makes as if to point at Jane, evidence, but Wendy's answer stops him. "I am." Does he hear the quaver as much as she tries to hold her voice steady? She should call Ned, her husband, downstairs in his study, either so absorbed in his books or asleep over them as to be oblivious to her flight down the hall. It's what a sensible person would do. There's an intruder in their home, in their daughter's room. Jane is in danger. Wendy swallows and faces Peter alone. "It's me, Peter. I grew up." Peter's expression turns into a sneer, Jane forgotten, all his attention on Wendy now. Jane looks in confusion between them. Wendy wants to tell her daughter to run. She wants to tell her to go back to sleep, it's only a dream. But the mocking edge in Peter's voice needles her, pulling her focus away. "What'd you go do that for?" Wendy's skin prickles again, hot and cold. The set of his mouth, arrogant as ever, the flicker brightness of his eyes, daring her to adventure, daring her to defy his word as law. "It happens," Wendy's voice steadies, anger edging out fear, to most of us at least. Peter, here, real, not a wild dream held as armor against the world. The years unspool around her as Wendy finally manages to step into her daughter's room. And that armor, polished and patched and fastened tight over the years, cracks. For a terrible moment, Jane is forgotten. Wendy's a creature made all of want, aching for the cold expression to melt from Peter's face, aching for her friend to take her hand and ask her to fly away with him. But his hand remains firmly planted on his hip, chin tilted so he can look down at her from his perch on the bed. Wendy takes a second step, and her armor is back in place. She takes a third step, and anger churns, stronger than desire, dark water trapped beneath a thick layer of ice. Wendy clamps her arms by her side, refusing to let one turn traitor and reach towards Peter. She is no longer the heartbroken girl left behind. She is what she's made of herself over the years. She held on to the truth even when Michael and John forgot. She survived being put away for her delusions, survived the injections, calmatives, and water cures meant to make her better. She fought, never stopped fighting. She refused to let Neverland go. It's been 11 years since St. Bernadette's, with its iron fences and high walls, full of frowning nurses and cruel attendants. A place meant to make her well, to cure her, though Wendy knows she was never sick at all. And here's the proof, standing before her on the end of her daughter's bed. Wendy straightens, hardening the line of her jaw, and meets Peter's eye. In the last 11 years, she's built a life for herself, for her husband and her daughter. She is not that lost and aching girl, and Peter has no power over the Wendy she's become. Peter. Wendy hears her own voice, stern, admonishing, the voice of a mother, but not the kind Peter ever wanted her to be. Before she can get any farther, Peter shakes his head, a single sharp motion, dislodging her words like a buzzing gnat circling him. His expression is simultaneously bored and annoyed. You're no fun. He spins as he says it, a fluid, elegant motion. Peter blurs, and Wendy thinks he's about to leave, but instead he seizes Jane's hand. Never mind, I'll take this Wendy instead. Peter leaps, yanking Jane into the air. Jane lets out a startled cry, and Wendy echoes it, a truncated burst of sound. She isn't quick enough to close the space between them as Peter dives for the window, Jane in tow. Instead, Wendy falls forward, bashing her knee painfully and catching herself on the windowsill. Wendy's fingertips brush Jane's heel and close on empty air. Peter spirals into the night, a cockscrow trailing in his wake, so familiar, so terrible it overwhelms her. Wendy doesn't hear if her daughter calls for her. The only sound in the world is the ringing echo of Peter's call as two child-sized figures disappear against a field of stars. That is the intro, and I'm going to skip a little bit to another chapter and read you a little bit more. The night air catches at Wendy's hair, tugging strands loose from her braid and blowing them against her cheeks. She looks down. It isn't that far to the courtyard below her window, but it's far enough. If she fails, if she falls, she'll break a bone at least, probably more than one. When she and John and Michael had first returned from Neverland all those years ago, Wendy had been dreadfully sick. She'd spent weeks in bed with a fever, as if something there had infected her body and she could no longer tolerate the London air. Her parents had been patient at first, bringing cold cloths for her forehead and warm broth to drink, holding her hand gently and asking her where they'd been. They'd been gone nearly 2 weeks, and then suddenly reappeared in the nursery again, as though they'd never left. She tried to explain, but it had sounded like a fairy tale, which is just what her mother and father had thought it was. They thought her confused, delirious with fever. When the fever had faded and the story persisted, they'd grown frustrated, even angry. She remembers the way John and Michael had looked between her and their parents, doubtful and a little afraid, wanting her assurances but not knowing who to believe. In the time she'd been sick in bed, their parents had already half convinced John and Michael that Neverland couldn't be real. Wherever they believed their children had actually been, Wendy never did discover. Only that in their minds, there was no doubt that the story she told could not possibly be true. They'd accused her of filling her brothers' heads with nonsense, confusing them. Already, Wendy could see the seeds of doubt taking root in Michael and John, and she'd been desperate to convince them, win them back to her side. She'd been afraid, heartbroken, and still sick in ways she couldn't explain, even though her fever had faded. How much easier it would be to hold on to Neverland if her brothers continued to believe in it too. Wendy had climbed to the top of the tall wardrobe in the nursery, not even hesitating a moment before she jumped. She'd been so certain she would fly around the ceiling, just like they did that first night with Peter. She hadn't felt a moment of doubt or fear until she'd crashed to the floor and broken her arm. Wendy rubs at her arm, as though she might still feel the ghost of that old fracture beneath her skin now. She'd been a child then. If she tries the same thing now, as a grown woman, how will she explain herself to Ned and to her brothers if she fails? Hysterical. The ghost of the word rings in her ears. John trusts her now, and even Michael. Would she undo all that? For a chance to save Jane? Yes. She could sneak down the back staircase, but what if her father-in-law left someone watching, one of the men from Scotland Yard, lurking in the shadows? No. The first time she traveled to Neverland, she left by the window. And Peter took Jane by the window, so she will go that way too. All her belief, held on to through the years, she must focus on that now, banish every shred of doubt. Her mind and her truth are her own. No part of her belongs to Dr. Harrington or her brothers. She is alone, and she alone can save Jane. Wendy fixes her gaze on the stars, pushing away thoughts of the hard, bruising, breaking stones below. Jane. She must think of Jane. Happy thoughts. She edges her foot forward. Except her happiest thought is also her most terrible. The memory of holding Jane for the very first time. The sweet, blood-sticky weight of her, red-faced and crying, placed into Wendy's arms. Jane had Ned's hair then, just a few strands of it plastered against her still-soft skull. In that moment, love had cracked Wendy wide open, leaving room for fear to slip in. Loving something means having something to lose. It's a truth Wendy has known since she lost Neverland, since Michael went to war and came home with ghosts in his eyes, since their parents boarded a ship doomed to sink. And oh, how much sharper that knowledge became when she first held Jane. How did her own mother feel all those years ago, entering the nursery to find not one but all three of her children gone? If she'd survived, maybe Wendy could have found a way to ask her, and to find out whether she too had been terrified when Wendy was first born. But she'd had no one to ask about being a mother, no one to warn her of all the ways it could make and unmake her heart in a single breath. Watching her daughter take her first step, watching her trip and fall. Had she and John and Michael even thought, as children, what their grand adventure would do to their parents? No, they'd been callous and cruel. They hadn't even looked back once as they'd flown in Peter's wake. And when they'd returned, Wendy's insistence on a grand adventure, her desire to return to that wonderful land that couldn't possibly exist, what must that have done to her parents' hearts? Not knowing how their children might have been hurt, where they'd gone? Finding their daughter, even returned to them, suddenly transformed into a stranger. Wendy herself had thought nothing of that then, how she made her parents' and her brothers' lives more difficult. She had thought only of freedom, as she leapt through the nursery window that night, with the chance to perhaps be something more than a second mother to her brothers, even for a little while. Then they'd arrived in Neverland, and she discovered a whole new set of rules, changing at Peter's whim. And he'd wanted her to be a mother to all of his boys, not just Michael and John. Even so, she'd still ached to return. Why? Was it that the good had outweighed the bad, or was it that she'd left a piece of herself behind, something unfinished, undone? Wendy peels her fingers from the window frame, takes a breath, empties her mind of everything but Jane, and lets go. Air whistles, shrill and sharp. Her clothing snaps like sails and flags on a long-ago pirate ship. Jane, Jane, Jane. Wendy thinks of her daughter fiercely, love and pain wrapped all in one. Happiness. Home. The thought slips in unbidden. She's going home. She shoots upwards, toes nearly scraping the courtyard stone as she rises sharply and soars over the gate, diving into the sky above London. Up, up, Wendy twists until the sky is beneath her, and she's swimming down into it, flying through to the other side of night where Neverland lies waiting. The rush of air is no longer a scream, but a triumphant yell. Her body remembers flight, the ache of muscles held taut against gravity, and the years fall away. Wendy stretches her arms, her shawl spread between them like wings, and embraces the glittering dark. She banks, rolls, then turns a loop, shedding fear with each motion. The map of London spread below her becomes mere points of light, blurred together as she gains speed. Is that Westminster Abbey? Kew Gardens? She skims low again before rising once more, a shooting star in reverse. It is glorious. The pain inside her uncoils, and for just a moment, Wendy allows herself to laugh out loud. The wind snatches the sound from her and streams it out behind her. Neverland. She marks the stars against the velvet sky. They're no longer the stars above London. She's already passed through that invisible barrier to where they're different, other, and impossible. Too far to turn back now. Not that she would. Wendy finds the second star from the right, knowing it like an anchor to her soul, and sets her course, flying straight on till morning. And so that is 2 excerpts of Wendy Darling. And hope.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was a great reading. I appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone else does too. Again, that was for those of you who have joined us since we started. That was AC Wise, and she's reading from her brand new novel, Wendy Darling, which is obvious to those of us who know anything about anything, is based on the original legend or the novel or the play of Peter Pan. What was the original inspiration that made you want to write Wendy Darling?
So it actually started out as a flash fiction story, which was published at Daily Science Fiction in 2017. And the sort of initial idea that came to my head was, what if the movie Taken was also Peter Pan? I figured that Wendy Darling has a very particular set of skills, much like Liam Neeson's character, and they would equip her perfectly to go to Neverland, face down Peter, and rescue her daughter. And when I wrote that flash fiction story, I kind of thought it was, just a silly one-off little thing, less than 2,000 words. And somehow the characters just kept talking to me, and I wanted to know more. I wanted to see Wendy actually go on the adventure that I'd set her up for in that initial story. And the whole thing built from there.
And what are some of the themes that you set out to explore in the novel?
So a lot of it is about mother-daughter relationships, obviously Wendy and her daughter Jane. There's a lot about found family and chosen family, and sort of the contrasts in the way Peter goes around kidnapping children and tries to sort of force a family connection, sort of contrasted with the way both Wendy and Jane kind of build their families around them along the way. I also wanted to look a little bit at queer identity, and I wanted to look at sort of the darkness that I think has sort of always been in the original story, and just bring all of that to the surface and kind of look at how creepy Peter Pan really is as a concept.
Yeah, I did notice that. I mean, there has always been a darkness, if you ignore the Disney, but in the original play, in the original stories, there's always been this darkness, and it's interesting how a lot of people ignore it, but how that you actually built on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just the fact of, like, if you just look at it, he's serially kidnapping children. I mean, that's kind of a dark thing. And, another sort of aspect of it for me is like, okay, well, somebody's utopia is always going to be somebody else's dystopia. So looking at what Neverland, which is sort of, built around being this ideal paradise for Peter and his lost boys, but then, who has to deal with the responsibility of that? It's Wendy has to be the mother, to clean up after them, to cook for them, to tell them stories. So, it's not exactly a paradise for her. She's the only sort of responsible one there, and they get to abdicate all responsibility and just keep playing forever. And I think there's a lot of sort of darkness in that too, when you shift the perspective a little bit and maybe look at it from a bit more of a feminist angle, and sort of see the horrors and being forced into a certain role and told, you're going to be a mother, and this is what motherhood means, and you don't have any choice in the matter.
And how does your version of the other characters, we meet Wendy, But you also have a different look on the Lost Boys, on who Captain Hook may have been or was. How did you reach? How did you get to those characters?
Well, I wanted to sort of have, some nods to the original and some nods even to, stuff that came after, some of the movies, including the Disney version, including Hook. Um, it's all sort of, in the background of my head as I was writing my own version. In a way, I sort of tried to make certain aspects a little more grounded and realistic, while still kind of keeping that fantastical sense to them, but maybe interrogating a little bit more, what being in that fantasy land would mean to them. So I'm thinking, I mean, Tinkerbell does not actually show up in the story at all, but we do get to see the mermaids. We do get sort of some hints of the pirates. And I guess it's maybe not a complete spoiler to say that there is a sequel in the works that is actually going to focus more on Hook,
Oh,
sort of go back and tell that story.
oh, cool. Okay.
Um,
We do meet Tiger Lily.
yeah, we do meet Tiger Lily and the Lost Boys. So in the original, I feel like they were all sort of given very, cutesy names, and they were all sort of very happy. And in my version, kind of the Lost Boys names shift a little bit, and they're not really sure of, who they are, who they might have been, if they've always been in Neverland, or if they were maybe stolen from somewhere else. And maybe, in bringing them there, Peter has taken something from them that they don't even really realize that they've lost. So again, that was more of that, leaning into the darkness and the kind of unsettling nature of Peter stealing children away to his version of paradise, which is very specifically his version of paradise.
And I'm curious as to where you drew your sources from, because there are so many places you can draw from. There's original short stories where Peter first appears. I noticed that you used the white bird in there, which most people don't even recognize.
Yeah.
And there's the play, then there's the novel. Was there any source that you particularly drew from?
I think it was sort of a little mix of things. I mean, obviously, sort of the original play and stories, but I did also want to sort of, if I'm recalling correctly, I think The Little White Bird was also sort of like a separate short story from Peter and Wendy. So
Yeah.
I didn't, draw from it completely, but I did want to reference it and kind of weave it in my own way, sort of make it a fairy tale that Wendy tells to herself and her daughter as kind of her way of understanding and processing Neverland. Um, and then again, sort of, keeping the other, versions and iterations in my mind, just sort of, as background to kind of pick and choose things here and there. And I think even sort of the fact that, the little white bird becomes a fairy tale within my story kind of speaks to the way, even though Peter Pan is actually, one story told by one author, it does sort of have that, fairy tale feel of being kind of a story that's been passed down and retold and reimagined. Has that sort of timeless feel to it, like it's something that's always existed, not something,
Yes.
one person wrote.
Definitely. Now, we're also taking questions from the audience, and I urge you either on YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on Facebook, to go ahead and ask questions. And we have one from Carol Geisinger, sorry, who says it's interesting to think as well. How do you go back home after an experience like that?
And that is actually another thing that I really wanted to explore with this novel. How do you cope with going back to sort of a mundane, uh, real world after you've been to a fantasy land? And how do you sort of reconcile those two realities? John and Michael cope with it by completely suppressing the memories of Neverland and denying that it ever existed, to the point where they actually believe that, you know, their sister is making things up or she's not well. Um, Wendy sort of doesn't cope per se, in terms of, she's always feeling caught between worlds. She always has this pull to go back to Neverland, even though, it wasn't entirely kind to her even the first time she was there. And she sort of discovers when she goes back that, it was maybe even worse than she remembered, but it still kind of has that pull, that hold over her. And I've always thought that was something kind of interesting about, portal fantasies in general. What comes after the end? What comes after, the children or the child usually is, returned back home from their magical world. Um, how do they live in reality again when nobody else necessarily believes them? Nobody else has had that experience. The world they come back to doesn't have talking animals. They can't fly at home. And how is that going to feel to them? So that is definitely something that I wanted to explore. And again, it doesn't go so well for Wendy trying to reintegrate into a world where magic isn't real.
Yeah. And the world that she needs to integrate into, of course, is a world that does not appear in the stories because, in the stories we're just with the children, but she comes back to a world not only that doesn't believe her, but where World War One takes place, where all these historical things are happening. And I really like the way you incorporated them into the novel. We're grown-ups now and we're seeing, we're no longer in Neverland and we're seeing what goes on in the grown-up world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the real world is much, much harsher. There's one line, if I can, I guess brag on my own book a little bit, or not really, but there's, one line in particular that I like, that's something to the effect of, the boys that never grew up back home were because, they were soldiers who went to war and now they're rotting in their graves. So it's sort of that sharp contrast between Neverland and kind of, that perpetual youth and innocence there, and kind of what youth and innocence was forced into back home in London with entering the war.
That's great. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask sort of a writer's question. I noticed that I love the way that you put the novel from three different points of view. You have Jane's point of view, you have Wendy's point of view in the past, and you have current Wendy. And that's a very hard thing to do, and you do it extremely well. How did you manage that?
I made it all up as I went along. I mean, one thing I kind of tried to do in terms of, kind of making the points of view at least a little bit distinct, was just sort of try to think about, the experiences that each character kind of had that were unique to them, that was going to inform the way they react to the world and sort of react to the situations around them. Jane is kind of, she wants to grow up to be a scientist. So she's got a very like, I must think about this rationally. I must, organize my thoughts and examine the situation. And Wendy's a little bit more, fanciful in her approach to the world. They're both kind of quick to anger, but I think, sometimes Jane has a little bit of a better handle on her emotions, even though she's the child and Wendy is the adult. And just, the fact of coming back from Neverland and being disbelieved and being told her truth, is not the truth. And sort of everything that Wendy's been through kind of makes her, more defensive, more quick to lash out, more maybe hesitant even to trust people. And she's sort of always got that sort of dual pull behind her into her nature. So I kind of tried to weave that into her perspective too, of, missing Neverland and kind of wanting to return to that sort of ideal simplicity, even though she sort of knows that it's never really been as ideal and simple as she would like to remember.
Well, her emotional journey throughout the book is fascinating. Now, you've up to now, you've been primarily a short story writer. What's your process like going from primarily writing short stories to writing your first novel?
I honestly sort of had to trick myself into it. As I mentioned, it started off life as a flash fiction story, which is just about as far away from a novel as you can get, sort of like, one of the shortest forms of fiction out there. And, the more I started thinking about that story and wanting to do something more with it, at first I kind of thought, well, maybe I could get it up to a novella length by expanding it a little bit. And then once I'd gotten to something that was roughly novella length, I had circulated it among some trusted first readers, and they're like, yeah, that's great, but it really needs to be a novel. There's more here. You need to kind of expand this. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And, if I was like, okay, maybe I can just try. And, if I don't like it, I can always take that out and try to keep it novella length. So I just sort of, expanded a little bit more, filled in some more gaps, and never really sort of admitted to myself that I was writing a novel. and that kind of kept it from being too intimidating and scary, jumping from short fiction to full novel length.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Just lie to yourself. It's fine. It's not really a novel. It doesn't matter.
It will be okay. You're not writing like several, tens of thousands of words. It's just
exactly. You're just adding a few words here and there. So see, you can use that with your own novel, since you're primarily a short fiction writer looking to maybe make that move too.
Why do you suppose Peter Pan is such an enduring character? The whole
has that sort of fairy tale feel to him. It feels like something, like I said before, that's sort of been around forever. And I think there is a lot of room kind of around the edges of the original story for people to reinterpret and to put their own versions to. I know a lot of authors have kind of done, more modern twists on it, or I was actually on a panel, or we called it the Peter Panel, haha, a few weeks back, where there were 4 authors total. We have books coming out, within a couple months of each other, all sort of inspired by Peter Pan. And I think, if I recall correctly, one had a very modern setting, one had sort of a more historical setting. Mine sort of had that historical setting, but was more focused towards an adult audience. Theirs were young adult. One kind of, again, sort of had like Peter in the modern world, with there were cell phones and, kind of modern teenagers and modern young people. And I feel like I've seen kind of, people do fun things with that take, or even the movie with Kate Winslet that sort of, takes the story of the author and kind of melds that with his creation. So I think there's just sort of a lot of richness in that original story that makes it just, a thing that you can kind of constantly reimagine in different ways, and it always feels fresh, and that kind of leads to it being an enduring story.
Do you have a favorite adaptation?
It's really hard to pick one. I mean, for all its problems, I guess I was sort of exposed to the Disney version at just the right age, so that it's always stuck with me. But I am also actually a big fan of that Kate. Again, it's not a direct Peter Pan reimagining, but the Kate Winslet movie that does sort of, tell the story of the author and melds it with Peter Pan.
I will put in my own oar at this point. If you ever have a chance to see, well, I don't know if it's ever going to come back to the theater, but if you ever have a chance to see a video of the Mabou Mines version of Peter and Wendy, where they do it with puppetry, and it's also a very dark but beautiful retelling. If you ever see a video of that, I would definitely go after that, because Jim and I saw it twice, once on our own and once with a child, just to see, and that is my favorite. So I'm going to.
That sounds very cool. I'm gonna have to look for that.
Yeah. Again, I'm asking people to ask questions either on Facebook or on YouTube. Cam Rob just came up to say hi.
Miss seeing you in person.
Carol says that I'm curious, AC, what do you think is the main point or theme of the original Peter Pan, and is it still relevant now?
That's a really good question. I feel like, and this is sort of just me guessing, not being in the author's head, but I feel like there was sort of a lot there about, innocence and kind of the contrast between, children and adults. And it's sort of interesting, like the way, the original ends is kind of, Wendy's daughter goes off with Peter, and then the next generation down goes off, and sort of so on. And there's a line I can't remember exactly about, Peter will also always be there as long as children are heartless. And it's just sort of interesting that like childhood innocence is kind of also like this sort of carelessness and abdication of responsibility. So I kind of almost feel like, maybe there was some recognition of the darkness, even, from sort of the author himself, of children leaving their parents behind and not really thinking about any of the consequences of their actions. And I feel like, there was, and I can't remember, this may have come up on that panel that I referenced, but I think there was something in particular, I think, that Barry was reacting to, and now I can't remember exactly what it was, but there were, specific themes that he was kind of trying to deal with and process through the story. And now, of course, I've completely forgotten. And it was, somebody saying something very smart who was, had done a lot of scholarly research and read a lot of like MFA and PhD thesis papers about Peter Pan and the deeper meaning behind it. And I probably really should have been taking notes so I could have a better answer for you for that question.
Yeah, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot right now. We still have at least 20 minutes to go. I was wondering if there was a short piece of the novel that you might want to also read to us.
Yeah, I mean, I could actually read a little bit of one of Jane's point of view
That would be great.
sections so people can kind of see the contrast between, Wendy's adventure and Jane's adventure. I can, and I might even actually be able to read the entire second chapter because I think it's pretty short. Just trying to find it. There we go. Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the time, but I might actually be able to get through the whole second chapter. So we shall see.
Okay, thank you.
So here we go. Never, never. A hush of sound like running water or a rolling storm. She turns her head towards the sound and finds her eyelids stuck shut. Has she been asleep? Dreaming? She dreamt of falling. No, flying. There's a smell of growing things. It reminds her of Kensington Gardens. She used to walk there with her parents when she was very small. And now that she's older, her father still takes her sometimes, looking for leaves and flowers and insects for her collections. Her favorite bit is the pond with its big white and gold fish coming to the surface to nibble at breadcrumbs, tails flashing and mouths making little O's. Her thoughts drift, simultaneously heavy, sticky as her eyes, and light. She was just in the gardens, wasn't she? Or no, she's in the gardens now, reaching to catch one of those golden white fish with her chubby fingers. No, that isn't right. That happened years ago. She was 4 years old and she wanted to catch a fish to show her papa, but her mama snatched her hand away with a sharp no. You never reach into the water like that, or you might fall in. It's an important rule, just like you must never go away with strangers and you must always stay where your papa and I can see you. Do you understand? She isn't that small anymore or foolish enough to need those lessons from her mother. Only she has gone away somewhere where her mama can't see her, and there's something wrong. There's a humming blank in her memory where her name should be. If she thinks hard enough, she can see her mother's lips move to shape the sound, but there's nothing there, only How could she possibly forget her own name? She must know it, somewhere, only there's something standing in the way. She tries to think it for herself, unsticks her lips to shout it aloud, but what comes out instead is, Mama! Her eyes fly open, painful, her lashes feeling like they're tearing as they part wide. There was a boy. He took her hand, and they fell into the sky. Her body jerks in panic, as though she's falling again, but there's a length of rope lying across her chest and legs, pinning her down. It's heavy, damp, and smells of salt and the green weediness she mistook for fish ponds. She tries to sit up, but her arms and legs are clumsy, flopping uselessly when she tries to push the rope away. Is she sick? Is that why she's so weak? Maybe the boy at her window was only a fever dream. Calm. She must be calm and take things one item at a time. Analyze her surroundings. That's what a good scientist would do, and she does intend to be a scientist one day. That much she knows, even if she can't remember her own name. She breathes in, focusing on what information she can gather while lying still. The ground beneath her is faintly damp, and it gives strangely beneath her. It certainly isn't her bedroom. None of her things are here. The globe her papa gave her on her last birthday, the magnifying glass she uses to see the delicate scales of butterfly wings and the veins in her leaves. Her mama warned her about going away with strangers, but she didn't, not on purpose. Tightness rises in her chest, making it hard to breathe, threatening her with tears. The sound of her involuntary hitching breath makes her angry, and she pushes the fear down as hard as she can. Panic won't do. She must be rational, assess her situation, look for clues. She turns her attention straight up, easy enough since she's lying on her back. Light filters through the branches laid together haphazardly, making a shelter. They're balanced against something solid. She's able to tilt her head far back enough to see the curving bulk of a wooden construction, but she isn't able to make out the whole. The harsh laughter of gulls calling to each other clarifies the sound of water. It's the steady hush of waves. She must be on a beach, but how is that possible? Her parents would have told her if they were planning a holiday, and certainly they wouldn't have spirited her away in the middle of the night. She would have packed appropriately, bringing her nets and collecting jars. And there's still the boy, and her mother reaching after her. She certainly isn't on holiday, and something is very wrong. Applying a burst of effort, she rolls onto her side, the coils of rope slithering free, not even tying her down, just piled haphazardly, as if someone meant to bind her and then forgot. She sits up, twisting around so she can see the curve of wood holding at the branches is the hull of a ship. The sand beneath her is wet, the dampness soaking through her nightgown, leaving her cold. "Wendy, you're awake!" The branches rustle, and the boy from her window pokes his head through them, grinning. Wendy. That's her mother's name, and she's Jane. The name is suddenly there, like something emerging from the fog, still half obscured, so she isn't certain it truly is familiar after all. Is it her? Her thoughts move slowly, like the long strings of almost burnt sugar cook pulls into caramel. She helps cook in the kitchen sometimes. The precision of the measurements please her, and the way slight variations can produce different results is just like a scientific experiment. But even better, at the end, patient stirring is rewarded with a taste test. She can almost feel the smoky sweetness on her tongue, the mass of candy clinging to her back teeth. She shakes her head, a sharp motion, bringing her thoughts back to the here and now. She isn't normally the flighty sort. She's a very sensible girl. Her mother and father have often told her so. Right now, though, her head feels thick and muzzy, and it's hard to concentrate. Who are you? She presses her back against the ship, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. He looks like a boy, not much older than her, but if he brought her here, if he stole her from her room, he might be something far more dangerous. I'm Peter, silly. The boy crab walks between the branches and into the shelter. She remembers landing, panic gripping her, and the boy pressing something into her hands, saying it would make her feel better. Was it medicine? She can't recall the details. Her memory is incomplete, scattered. A broken shard of sky sliding free, the beach tilting beneath her, the hard rain of stars. Darkness. It was night when they arrived, and it's morning now, or even afternoon. How long has she been gone? Her parents must be worried sick about her. I have to get... She starts to demand he take her home, glaring at Peter as she does, but her tongue sticks to the roof of her mouth. Her throat is bone dry, and the words get lost between her tongue and her lips. They jumble in her mind, and she can't put them in the right order again, even in her head. Frustrated, she snaps her mouth closed, staring at Peter. He's done something to her, bewitched her like one of the fairy tales her mama used to tell her. He might even be a creature out of one of those stories. There's a scent to him, wild and raw, like the green pond smell from earlier, but also like honey. They fell through the world, like a night falling into fairy, and now she's here, wherever here might be. Sunlight peeks through the branches and glints in Peter's hair, a fire consuming everything in its path. He watches her in turn, tilting his head as if her stillness and silence puzzles him, as if she's the strange creature from another world, which here she might be for all she knows. His hands dangle loose between his knees, which stick up at odd angles from the way he crouches on the sand. Freckles spray his nose and cheeks like stars, but the color of rust. His teeth are too sharp. The thought chills her, and she looks away. It must be the branches casting shadows through his smile. She almost convinces herself and risks another glance. He lowers his lashes, peeking at her almost shyly, as if to show her she has no reason to be afraid. His eyes, they're a gray-blue like a storm, like the pigeons in Trafalgar Square. What is this place? She finally manages to put words in order, and they're far gentler than what she meant to say. She wants to call him a rotten thief and shout at him until he tells her where her parents are. It's Neverland, of course. Where else would it be? Peter says the words like she should know what he means, even though he's speaking complete nonsense. She studied every single part of the globe her father gave her, and there's no such place as Neverland. How could you forget? Peter says. She shakes her head, too frightened now for words. There's a cold, crawling feeling in her stomach. Something important she's missing. I'm Peter, he points at himself, speaking slowly and loudly now, and then points at her. And you're Wendy. That's not my name. The fear spikes, scrabbling in her chest. That's my mother's name. But when she reaches for her name, it's gone again. Her voice wobbles. She has a feeling like she's looking at a puzzle. Pieces are there, only she can't fit them together. Peter's smile flickers, a candle guttered with darkness, but returns an instant later just as bright. Of course you're the Wendy. I found you and brought you back to Neverland so you can be our mother again. That's the way it works. He tilts his head again, making her think of a bird. Not pigeons this time, something sharper and cleverer, like a starling or a crow. He's still smiling, but it's a hard smile. He isn't making any sense, but she's afraid to ask him to explain himself again, or tell him that he's wrong. There's no such place as Neverland, and there can't be, and he needs to take her home. She looks closer. Peter isn't a starling at all. He's a different bird. One with a beak hooked for hunting. A hawk, maybe? Why does she think of birds every time she looks at him? The answer is almost there. She can feel it, but every time she concentrates on it, it slips away from her. She doesn't want to think about what she doesn't know. It's too big and too frightening. She tries hard enough. Perhaps she can convince herself this is all a bad dream. Her mother and father will come for her soon, and everything will go back to the way it's supposed to be. They'll wrap her up in a warm blanket and set her in front of a fire. Cook will make scones with clotted cream and jam for tea, and they'll all listen rapt as she relates the story of her grand adventure. Perhaps her mother will even bring out the special china, the set that belonged to the grandmother she never met. It'll be a proper celebration to show how happy they are that she's home. Her mama smiling, the light her papa gets in his eyes when he's listening to someone tell a particularly good tale. Her eyes prickle, but she forces a smile to show she isn't afraid. I brought you more to drink. Peter reaches outside the shelter to retrieve a tarnished silver cup stamped with a pattern. It'll make you well again, so you remember Neverland. He extends the cup towards her with an encouraging expression. Is this what he gave her before? It doesn't look like medicine, and it smells sweet. Despite Peter's claim it will make her better, she isn't certain she wants to drink it at all. How can it help her remember a place she's never been? A place that doesn't even exist? And actually, I've got one page left, so I think there's just enough time for it. She stalls, examining the cup, aware of Peter watching her with impatience growing in his eyes. She recognizes the insignia stamped on the cup's side, His Majesty's Royal Navy. Her papa took her to see the ships in the harbor once, bright sails fluttering from their tall masts, so beautiful and proud. How is it that she can remember that and not her own name? Drink. Peter nudges her fingers, and the cup is halfway to her lips without even realizing she's taken it from his hand. He pushes at the bottom of the cup, tilting it so she has no choice but to swallow the liquid or choke on it. It's thick and sweet. It tastes good, and even as she's drinking it, it makes her thirsty for more. She drains the cup, and Peter watches in approval. She knows it isn't wise to take things from people she doesn't know, especially not food or drink. But with the cup empty, she does feel better. Perhaps Peter isn't dangerous after all. Perhaps he really does want to help her. The crawling feeling inside her calms, fear receding. Even sitting on the cold, wet sand, she feels safe and warm, like floating in a hot bath. She yawns widely. You can sleep now if you'd like, Peter says. We'll play a game when you wake up. I bet you have all sorts of new things to teach us. Before she can ask what he means, he's gone, quick as a flash, scuttling out through the gap in the branches. She wants to call after him, but her tongue feels even heavier than before. Maybe she will lie down after all. Her insides feel warm from the drink, even better than the tea cook makes. It's like being wrapped in a blanket, tight like a cocoon. Maybe when she wakes, she'll be a butterfly. The thought makes her smile, already drifting. She is safe here. There's no reason to be afraid at all.
Thank you, AC Wise. This was another part of her new novel, Wendy Darling, and I love how at the end she feels so safe, and the reader is going, "Oh my God!"
Like, viewers watching a horror movie screaming, "Get out! Get out! Get out!"
Yes, I also love the way that, and as you described it before, Jane is her own person here, and she's trying to reason her way at this really strange place to the point where she is actually trying to classify which bird Peter reminds her of. So that's really great. We have a lot of happy applause and people saying nice. Jim Ryan saying nice. We have a question from Jonathan Gladstone Gelman. Is there a sense in the story that when in the Neverland, it is our world that seems fanciful and made up? When I dream, I have a sense of that our world is something I made up, and I have to make myself forget how to fly.
It's really interesting, actually. I guess maybe yes and no. There are ways in which I think the real world kind of feels a little far away and strange, and maybe, I don't know if unreal is quite the right word, but sort of like not the place, at least for Wendy, where she feels like she belongs. There are times when she herself feels more real in Neverland than she does in London. So I guess it's maybe more, her reaction to the place than the world itself that she came from feeling unreal.
And I'd also want to say that, and this occurred to me while you were reading, that I really, really like the cover of the book.
I feel like I've gotten very, very lucky with my
yes,
with my covers.
The art for it is very lovely and very apt, and it gives you a real sense of what's going on. So tell me, what else are you working on, or that you have coming up that you want people to know about?
So I have been working on the as yet untitled sequel, or companion novel, whatever you want to call it. And coming up, I have my collection, The Ghost Sequences, which will be out on October 19th. I just found out the official release date for that. So that is all ghost stories or stories related to ghosts and hauntings coming out from Undertow Books. It is now available for pre-order on their website and all the other fine places one can procure books. And it has an original novelette in it as well. It's definitely much more horror focused. So perfectly in time for Halloween.
And are there any, and as if that wasn't enough, do you have any other short stories or anything else coming out? Or are you concentrating more on the new novel?
I have a couple of other short stories I think that will be out later this year. There's a story coming out in Bourbon Pen. I'm not sure exactly when that will be out, but it's sort of playing with Gothic tropes and kind of the woman in the attic trope a little bit. There is, I'm trying to remember, there's a story that'll be coming out in Kaleidotrope. I think that'll be out this year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like a dark mythological kind of story. And there may be a couple other things, but I'm not actually sure of, the publication dates of any things. So maybe it'll be this year, maybe it'll be next year, not entirely sure. And I'm always sort of working on short stories in the background. So, maybe one of those will find a home before the year's out. You never know.
Okay, I'm going to give the people at home, as if we weren't all at home, the chance to ask a last question. Just type your question as the little running piece of type says. Type your question in the comments and we'll answer them for you. Can you give us a sort of a hint? How do you see somebody like Hook as opposed to the children in Peter Pan? You know, it's very weird that Hook is like the only adult.
Yeah, and I feel like there's definitely some weirdness there of like being an adult and kind of almost being thrust into the role of a villain, kind of the same way Wendy is told, "You are our mother now, and this is how you have to be." I feel like there's a little bit of that going on with Hook too. "You are my enemy now, and this is the way you have to be." So there's a little bit of sort of tragedy to him, but he also does sort of embrace the role of villainy in some ways as well. So he's kind of a complicated character or
Yeah.
a gray character, maybe.
Very
You know,
complicated.
not entirely good, not entirely bad.
I would find it very interesting that in theatrical performances of Peter Pan, or in movies even occasionally, very often the actor who plays the father, the children's father, is the one who plays Hook.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting, but it's like the adults as the villains that are
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
standing in the way of adventure and ruining all the fun.
That's basically what it. Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about the novel that we haven't got? Oh, wait, we have a question from our audience. Carol wants to know, how well does your brain work with switching between a novel and short stories? Do you have any tricks to keep your finger in the right spot of the novel?
Hmm. I mean, I try as much as possible to sort of focus on one thing at a time. Doesn't always necessarily work out that way, but sort of, complete one thing, then maybe move to like sort of a short story as a break. So I'm not sort of switching back and forth between them too much. That doesn't always work. Sometimes the brain gets distracted by the shiny new thing over here as opposed to the thing one is supposed to be working on. But I do leave a lot of notes for myself if I'm sort of partway through something and not to the end of it. So at least I kind of have a vague roadmap of where I was going when I go back to it. I don't tend to outline all that much, but I do sort of leave sketched like this happens next, or this should happen at some point. So at least I kind of have that sort of placeholder for myself when I come back and go, oh yeah, that's what I was going to do next.
And what kind of tools do you use? I mean, do you use any specific type of software? Do you write it out? Do you, just use?
Just a nice simple Word document.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, my handwriting is atrocious, and I feel like it, takes me longer to write things by hand. So I'd rather be typing on a keyboard so I can get the thoughts out fast before they run away from me.
Okay. We have somebody who says, can't wait to read the rest.
Really hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much. We've been talking to AC Wise about her great new novel based on Peter Pan, called Wendy Darling, published by Titan Books. It's out now, and I urge you to go out and buy it or rent it or get it out of the library, although the wait for that is going to be a bit long, because it's an excellent, excellent book. Thank you very, very much for appearing at NYRSF. Next month, Tuesday, July 6th at 7 p.m., we will have another reader. We don't know who, but I'm sure she or they will be fabulous. Thank you very much, people, for coming. Thank you to Jim Freund, who is the man behind all this, behind NYRSF, and who may also be the man in front of the camera next month, who knows. And my name is Barbara Krasnoff, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everybody for coming.